Jacob Walker, a 17-year-old black teen, was just driving home. He never imagined his peaceful drive would turn into a nightmare when two police officers pulled him over for no reason. What happened next will leave you speechless. As they pinned him to the ground, a motorcade approached, and out stepped former President Donald Trump. What he did will shock you. Stay with us until the end, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Your support helps spread these powerful stories. Let us know where you're watching from in the comments. Jacob Walker, a 17-year-old black teenager, was driving home along the quiet stretch of Highway 64. The evening sun dipped low in the sky, casting a warm orange glow over the asphalt. His hands rested firmly on the steering wheel of his worn-down sedan, a car he had saved up for by working part-time jobs after school. The music playing softly from the car speakers was calming, and for a moment, Jacob felt a rare sense of peace. It wasn't often that he got to enjoy moments like this, a calm drive with nothing but open road ahead. The highway was mostly empty, save for a few distant cars that sped by in the opposite direction. Jacob glanced at the clock on the dashboard and noted that he would be home just in time for dinner with his mother. She always worried when he was out too late. The thought of her waiting for him brought a small smile to his face. He adjusted his rearview mirror and noticed a pair of headlights in the distance behind him, slowly growing closer. A few moments later, red and blue lights flashed in his mirror, casting an ominous glow inside his car. His heart sank. Jacob checked his speedometer. He wasn't speeding. He had done nothing wrong. Confused, he glanced at the police cruiser gaining on him and sighed. His mother's voice echoed in his mind, always warning him to be careful if he ever encountered the police. Keep your hands visible. Be polite. Don't make any sudden movements. He signaled and pulled over to the shoulder of the road, the gravel crunching under his tires as he came to a stop. The patrol car pulled up behind him, its lights still flashing. Jacob turned off the engine and took a deep breath. He placed both hands on the steering wheel, just as he had been taught. His heart pounded in his chest as he watched the officer step out of the cruiser and approach his car. The officer was tall, with a buzz cut and mirrored sunglasses that reflected Jacob's anxious face. Behind him, another officer stood by the patrol car, his posture stiff and his gaze sharp. The first officer reached Jacob's window, tapping on the glass with a stern expression. Jacob rolled down the window, keeping his hands on the steering wheel. "License and registration," the officer demanded, his voice cold and devoid of any politeness. Jacob moved slowly, reaching for his glove compartment. "It's in here," he said, his voice steady but polite. He handed over his license and registration, offering a faint smile. "Is there a problem, officer?" The man took Jacob's license and stared at it for a long moment before glancing at him again. "You own this car?" "Yes, sir." The officer's lips twitched into something resembling a smirk. Mind telling me where you're headed?" "I'm driving home," Jacob replied, trying to keep his tone calm. "Just passing through." The officer didn't seem convinced. He handed Jacob's license to his partner and motioned for Jacob to step out of the car. Jacob's heart skipped a beat. "Why do I need to step out?" he asked cautiously. "Step out of the car," the officer repeated, his voice harder this time. Jacob swallowed his protests and complied. As soon as he stepped onto the gravel, the second officer moved closer, his eyes narrowing as he scanned Jacob from head to toe. His gaze lingered on Jacob's clothes, his shoes, the car he had been driving. "This is a pretty expensive car," the officer said, gesturing toward the sedan. "What do you do for a living?" "I'm a student," Jacob answered, his voice firm. "A student, driving something like this?" The officer let out a short, condescending laugh. Jacob clenched his jaw, but he bit his tongue. He had heard this tone before, the disbelief, the accusation hidden beneath the words. No matter what he said, they wouldn't believe him. He had seen stories like this play out too many times. "Do you have any weapons in the car?" the first officer asked, circling around to the driver's side. "No," Jacob replied quickly. "Drugs? Alcohol?" "No." Without waiting for permission, the officer opened the driver's side door and began rummaging through Jacob's belongings. "Hey," Jacob protested, "you can't do that." The officer ignored him, pulling open the glove compartment and rifling through the contents. He pulled out Jacob's backpack and unzipped it, spilling its contents onto the passenger seat. The second officer stepped closer to Jacob, his hand hovering near his holster. "Ma'am, you need to calm down." Jacob's pulse spiked. He glanced at the officer's hand, noting how close it was to his gun. "I'm calm," Jacob said, though his voice trembled slightly. He reached for his phone in his pocket. "Don't move," the first officer barked, slamming the car door shut. Jacob froze, his hand halfway to his pocket. "I'm calling my mother," he said, fighting to keep his voice steady. The officers exchanged a look, their expressions darkening. "Your mother?" the taller officer sneered. "And what's she going to do?" Jacob shook his head. "I know my rights." The officer's smirk widened. "Oh, you know your rights, do you?" Before Jacob could respond, a second officer grabbed him by the arm and roughly turned him around. "Hands behind your back." Jacob tensed. "Why? I haven't done anything." The officer ignored him, pulling out a pair of handcuffs and snapping them onto Jacob's wrists with a harsh click. The metal bit into Jacob's skin, and he winced. "This is unnecessary," Jacob protested. "I'm not resisting." But the officers weren't listening. They pushed him down onto the gravel, pressing his face into the dirt. Jacob's mind raced. How had this escalated so quickly? He had done everything right, kept his hands visible, answered their questions, complied with their orders. And yet, here he was, face down on the side of the road with handcuffs cutting into his wrists. As he lay there, the sound of approaching engines reached his ears. The officers must have heard it too, because they both turned their heads toward the road. 3 black SUVs appeared in the distance, their tinted windows gleaming in the fading sunlight. They moved with precision, slowing as they approached the scene. Jacob's breath caught in his throat. The vehicles pulled over to the shoulder of the road, blocking the patrol car from view. The officers stiffened, exchanging uneasy glances. The doors of the SUVs opened, and men in dark suits stepped out, their eyes scanning the area with practiced precision. And then, stepping out of the lead vehicle, was a figure Jacob recognized immediately. Donald Trump. The former president's expression was calm but unreadable as he took in the scene before him. His gaze settled on Jacob, lying on the ground with his hands cuffed behind his back. Jacob's heart pounded in his chest as Trump approached, his polished shoes crunching against the gravel. The officers seemed frozen in place, their earlier confidence replaced by uncertainty. Trump stopped a few feet away, his eyes locking onto Jacob's. "Are you okay?" Jacob lay on the gravel, his cheek pressed against the cold ground, feeling the rough surface bite into his skin. The tightness of the handcuffs cut into his wrists, and his breathing was shallow and ragged. His mind was racing, replaying every second of the interaction that had led him here. He had done nothing wrong, nothing to deserve this, but none of that seemed to matter. His heart thumped loudly in his chest as the sound of approaching footsteps pulled him back to the present. The officers still hadn't noticed the figure approaching them from behind. The taller officer leaned down, his voice low and laced with disdain. "Kids like you need to learn their place." Jacob bit his tongue, refusing to give the man the satisfaction of a reaction. Instead, he focused on steadying his breath, on not letting the fear take over. But the sound of engines rumbling closer made the officers pause. They exchanged glances before turning toward the road. The sight of the 3 black SUVs pulling up made them tense, and they instinctively straightened, their earlier bravado faltering. The lead SUV came to a stop just a few feet away, and the doors opened in unison. Jacob could see polished black shoes stepping onto the gravel, followed by dark suits and earpieces. The security detail moved with precision, scanning the area, their expressions unreadable. The officers stiffened, their hands moving instinctively toward their holsters, but they hesitated when they realized who was stepping out of the lead vehicle. Donald Trump emerged from the SUV with the practiced ease of someone who was used to commanding attention. He wasn't wearing a tie, and his sleeves were rolled up slightly, giving him a more casual appearance. But there was nothing casual about his presence. His eyes locked onto the scene in front of him, Jacob on the ground, the officers standing stiffly nearby, and his expression hardened. The taller officer was the first to recover. He took a step forward, his posture stiff and defensive. "Sir, this is a routine traffic stop. We have it under control." Trump didn't respond immediately. He continued walking toward them, his gaze lingering on Jacob for a moment before shifting to the officers. There was a weight to his silence that made the air feel heavier, more charged. Jacob could feel it too. He pushed himself up slightly, wincing as the handcuffs bit into his wrists. "What's his crime?" Trump's voice cut through the tension, steady and authoritative. The officers exchanged a glance, the shorter one speaking up this time. "Sir, he was acting suspiciously. We had reason to believe the vehicle might be stolen." Trump raised an eyebrow. "Suspicious? Based on what?" The officers hesitated, and the taller one cleared his throat. "It's a high-value vehicle, and this kid—" Trump's gaze sharpened. "Stop." His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that made both officers freeze. He took another step closer, his eyes narrowing. "Are you telling me you pulled him over because he's driving a car you think he shouldn't be driving?" The officers remained silent, their earlier confidence eroding under Trump's scrutiny. Trump turned his attention back to Jacob. "Are you all right, son?" Jacob nodded slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, sir." Trump's expression softened slightly as he crouched down to Jacob's level. "What's your name?" "Jacob Walker." Trump gave a small nod before straightening up and turning back to the officers. "Take those cuffs off him." The taller officer stiffened. "Sir, we were just—" "Now." Trump's voice was cold, leaving no room for argument. The shorter officer stepped forward reluctantly, pulling out the key to the handcuffs. He unlocked them with a click, and Jacob rubbed his sore wrists, his fingers trembling slightly. Trump watched the interaction closely, his expression unreadable. As soon as the cuffs were off, Trump gestured toward one of the men in his security detail. "Get him some water." The agent nodded and retrieved a bottle from the SUV, handing it to Jacob. Jacob took it with shaky hands, murmuring a quiet, "Thank you." Trump folded his arms, turning his attention back to the officers. "What's your name?" he asked the taller officer. "Officer Grant," the man replied stiffly. "And yours?" Trump's gaze shifted to the shorter officer. "Officer Daniels." Trump nodded slowly, his gaze piercing. "Do you know who I am?" Both officers nodded quickly, their postures rigid. "Yes, sir." "Then you should know that what I just saw is unacceptable. You humiliated that boy, profiled him, and treated him like a criminal without any evidence. That's not policing. That's abuse of power." "Sir, we were just doing our job," Grant said, his voice wavering slightly. Trump took a step closer, his gaze never wavering. Your job is to protect and serve, not to intimidate and humiliate. Tell me, did you even ask for his registration, or did you jump straight to putting him in handcuffs?" Neither officer responded. Their silence spoke volumes. Trump exhaled sharply. "That's what I thought." There was a long pause before Trump spoke again. "I want your badge numbers and the name of your supervisor." Grant hesitated. "Sir, we can explain." "I'm not interested in explanations," Trump interrupted. "I'm interested in accountability." Daniels fumbled for his notepad and scribbled down the information, handing it to one of Trump's agents. Trump turned back to Jacob. "Do you have someone you can call? Your parents?" Jacob nodded. "My mom." "Call her. Let her know you're all right." Jacob pulled out his phone, his hands still shaking slightly. He dialed his mom's number, and as it rang, he glanced at Trump. "Thank you," he said quietly. Trump nodded once, his expression softening. No one should have to go through that. The conversation between Jacob and his mom was brief. He reassured her that he was fine, that someone had helped him. She sounded worried, but relieved to hear his voice. When Jacob hung up, Trump placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You're free to go." Jacob glanced at the officers, who were now standing stiffly to the side, their expressions a mix of shame and unease. He took a deep breath and nodded. "Thank you, sir." Trump gave him a small smile. "Stay safe out there." As Jacob climbed back into his car, he glanced in the rearview mirror. Trump was still standing by the side of the road, watching him drive off. The black SUVs began to move, following Jacob for a short distance before turning back toward the highway. Jacob's hands trembled slightly on the steering wheel as he continued his drive home. The fear and humiliation he had felt moments ago were still fresh in his mind, but they were slowly being replaced by a sense of relief and gratitude. He had no idea what might have happened if Trump hadn't stopped. As the sun dipped lower on the horizon, Jacob felt a surge of determination. This wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who had ever been profiled or mistreated by those in power. And for the first time, he felt like someone had truly seen him, not as a suspect, not as a threat, but as a person. The road stretched out before him, endless and open. Jacob's car moved slowly down the highway, the rumble of the engine steady, but his mind raced with everything that had just happened. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white. He glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. The black SUVs that had pulled over to help him were now disappearing into the distance, but the memory of what had just unfolded lingered heavily in his mind. The way those officers had looked at him, the way they had treated him, and the way Donald Trump had arrived, stepping out of his vehicle like something out of a movie, it all felt surreal. His phone buzzed on the passenger seat. He reached over, his fingers trembling slightly, and picked it up. There were already several missed calls from his mother, along with a series of frantic texts. "Are you okay? Call me back now." Jacob swallowed hard and dialed her number. The phone barely rang once before she picked up. Jacob, where are you? Are you all right? Her voice was high-pitched and filled with worry. I'm okay, Mom, he said softly, though the tremor in his voice betrayed his lingering fear. I'm on my way home. What happened? Why were you pulled over? Who was that man you said helped you? Her words tumbled out quickly, one after another, without pause. Jacob took a deep breath, trying to steady himself before answering. It was the police. They pulled me over, said my car looked suspicious or something. I don't know. They handcuffed me, Mom. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and when his mother spoke again, her voice was quieter but no less urgent. They did what? They made me get out of the car, put me on the ground, and cuffed me. But someone stopped to help. Who? She asked, her voice trembling with a mix of relief and confusion. Jacob hesitated, still processing the moment himself. It was Donald Trump. He saw everything. He made them take off the handcuffs and let me go. There was another long silence on the line. Jacob could almost hear his mother trying to make sense of what he'd just said. Donald Trump? Are you serious? Yeah, Jacob said. It sounds crazy, I know, but it was him. His security team was with him and everything. He asked for their badge numbers and told me to call you. His mother exhaled shakily. Thank God he was there. Jacob nodded, even though she couldn't see him. I'll be home soon. Okay, she said quietly. Just drive safe. We'll talk when you get here. When the call ended, Jacob placed the phone back on the seat beside him and kept driving. The highway stretched out endlessly in front of him, the fading light of the evening casting long shadows across the landscape. He couldn't shake the feeling that his life had just changed forever. What would have happened if Trump hadn't been there? Would those officers have let him go, or would they have taken him in? The thought sent a shiver down his spine. Meanwhile, back at the scene, Donald Trump remained standing with his arms folded, watching as his security detail collected information from the officers. The two policemen, Grant and Daniels, stood stiffly by the side of the road, their earlier arrogance completely gone. Their faces were pale, and their hands twitched nervously at their sides. They had clearly realized the gravity of their situation. One of Trump's agents approached him with a clipboard in hand. We've got their badge numbers and contact information for their supervisor, the agent said. Good, Trump replied, his voice calm but firm. His gaze remained locked on the two officers. Now I want you to make sure that this doesn't get swept under the rug. I want their actions reported to the proper authorities. And I want a formal complaint filed. Yes, sir. Trump took a step closer to the officers, his expression stern. You two should be ashamed of yourselves. Grant opened his mouth as if to protest, but Trump cut him off. I don't want to hear it. I saw exactly what you did. You pulled that kid over because of the car he was driving and the color of his skin. That's profiling. That's racism. And it's unacceptable. Daniels shifted uncomfortably, avoiding Trump's gaze. Sir, we didn't know who he was. Trump's eyes narrowed. It shouldn't matter who he is. It shouldn't take the arrival of a former president for you to treat someone with basic respect and dignity. Your job is to protect and serve. Do you even understand what that means? Neither officer responded. They stood there, stiff and silent, clearly regretting their actions. Trump shook his head. People like you are why we're still having these conversations. People like you are why young black men are afraid to drive down the street, afraid to walk in their own neighborhoods. You think you can get away with it because no one will hold you accountable. Well, not today. Grant finally found his voice. Sir, We were just following protocol." "No, you weren't," Trump interrupted, his voice rising slightly. "What you did wasn't protocol. It was abuse of power, and you're going to face the consequences." He turned back to his security detail. "Make sure the Department of Justice gets a full report on this. I want those two held accountable for what they did." "Yes, Mr. President," one of the agents replied. Trump glanced at the officers one last time. "You're done here. Go back to your precinct and explain to your supervisor why you've been reported." The officers hesitated, clearly unsure whether to stay or go. Trump's gaze hardened. "Now." With that, the officers finally moved, walking stiffly back to their patrol car. They didn't look back as they got in and drove off, their taillights disappearing down the highway. As the SUVs began to pull away, Trump leaned back against his car, rubbing his temples briefly before straightening up. "Let's head back," he said to his security team. "We've got work to do." His words hung heavily in the air as the convoy returned to the road. Inside the lead vehicle, Trump sat in silence for a moment, his thoughts clearly elsewhere. One of his aides glanced at him cautiously. "Sir, do you think this will get out?" Trump nodded slowly. "It will, and it should." Meanwhile, as Jacob neared his home, he began to notice notifications popping up on his phone. His social media accounts were buzzing with message likes and shares. Someone must have recorded the encounter on the highway. He scrolled through his feed, seeing post after post about what had happened. Videos were already circulating, clips of Trump stepping out of his SUV, confronting the officers, and standing by Jacob's side. Jacob's heart pounded as he watched the footage. The comments beneath the videos were filled with shock, outrage, and gratitude toward Trump for stepping in. People were calling it a turning point, a powerful moment that highlighted the ongoing issue of racial profiling. When Jacob finally pulled into his driveway, he sat in his car for a moment, staring at the house he had grown up in. His mother opened the front door and stepped outside, her expression one of both relief and concern. He got out of the car and walked toward her, his legs feeling unsteady. As soon as he reached her, she pulled him into a tight hug. "I'm so glad you're okay." Jacob hugged her back, feeling the weight of the day settle on his shoulders. "I'm okay, Mom. I'm really okay." They went inside, and Jacob sat down at the kitchen table, his hands still trembling slightly. His mother poured him a glass of water and sat across from him. "Tell me everything." Jacob did, recounting every detail of what had happened on the highway. His mother listened intently, her expression shifting from shock to anger to relief as he spoke. When he finished, she reached across the table and took his hands in hers. "You're safe now," she said softly. "That's all that matters." Jacob nodded, but he couldn't shake the lingering thought in the back of his mind. This isn't over. By the next morning, the story of Jacob's encounter with the police and Donald Trump's intervention had spread like wildfire. Social media platforms were buzzing with videos and posts about what had happened on that quiet stretch of highway. News outlets picked up the story quickly, each one adding their own spin to the narrative. Headlines like "Trump stands up against racial profiling" and "Former President defends Black teen from police abuse" flooded the internet and television screens across the country. Jacob sat at the kitchen table with his mother, his phone buzzing non-stop with messages and notifications. He had barely slept the night before, his mind racing with thoughts about what could have happened if Trump hadn't shown up. His mother sat across from him, scrolling through her own phone, her face a mixture of worry and pride. "They're talking about you on the news," she said softly, glancing up at him. "People are calling you brave." Jacob shook his head. "I didn't do anything brave. I was just there." His mother reached across the table and took his hand. "You stood your ground. You didn't let them break you. That's bravery." Jacob glanced at his phone again, scrolling through the endless stream of comments and messages. Some were supportive, praising him for his strength and resilience. Others were less kind, accusing him of playing the victim or using the situation for attention. He tried to focus on the positive messages, but the negativity still gnawed at him. Suddenly, his phone buzzed with an incoming call. He glanced at the screen, his eyes widening when he saw the name displayed. "Mom, it's him," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Who?" "Donald Trump." His mother's eyes widened in surprise. "Well, don't just sit there. Answer it." Jacob took a deep breath and swiped to answer the call. "Hello?" "Jacob, it's Donald Trump. How are you doing today?" Jacob swallowed hard, still trying to wrap his mind around the fact that he was speaking to the former president of the United States. I'm okay, sir. Thank you." "I've been following the news," Trump continued, his voice calm but firm. "I wanted to make sure you're holding up all right. I know it's a lot to process." Jacob nodded, even though Trump couldn't see him. "Yeah, it's been overwhelming." "I can imagine. But you handled yourself well out there. I saw it firsthand." Jacob's grip on the phone tightened. "Thank you, sir. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't stopped." "That's exactly why I stopped," Trump said, "because I knew what could have happened. And that's why we need to make sure something comes out of this. It can't just be another story that fades away." Jacob felt a surge of gratitude. "I agree." "Good," Trump said. "Now, listen, there's going to be a lot of attention on you in the coming days. People will want to hear your side of the story. But I want you to remember one thing. This isn't just about you. It's about everyone who's ever been in your position. People who didn't have someone there to step in." Jacob nodded again, his resolve strengthening. "I understand." "Good. We're going to keep the pressure on," Trump continued. "I've already spoken to the Department of Justice. They're launching an investigation into the officers who stopped you, and I've made it clear that I expect real accountability." Jacob's heart pounded. "Do you think they'll actually face consequences?" "They will," Trump said firmly. "I won't let this slide. We're also pushing for reforms to make sure this doesn't happen to someone else." Jacob glanced at his mother, who was watching him with a mixture of pride and concern. "Thank you, Mr. Trump, really." Trump's voice softened slightly. "Don't thank me. Just keep speaking the truth. People are listening." After they ended the call, Jacob sat in silence for a moment, processing everything. His mother leaned forward, her eyes shining with emotion. "Jacob, do you realize what just happened? You're part of something big." Jacob nodded slowly. "I know." The next few days were a whirlwind of media coverage and public reaction. Protesters gathered outside police departments, demanding justice for Jacob and accountability for officers like Grant and Daniels. Activists used the incident as a rallying cry, calling for sweeping reforms in law enforcement practices. Social media continued to buzz with hashtags like #JusticeForJacob and #End Racial Profiling. But with the support came backlash. Some people accused Jacob of exaggerating the encounter or using it to gain attention. Others criticized Trump's involvement, claiming it was a publicity stunt. Jacob tried to tune out the negativity, focusing instead on the overwhelming support he received from people across the country. One afternoon, Jacob received a message from a young man in a different state. The message read, "I saw what happened to you. I've been stopped by the police for no reason too. Seeing you stand up gives me hope. Thank you for being brave." Jacob read the message twice, a lump forming in his throat. He forwarded it to his mother along with a simple message of his own. This is why it matters. Meanwhile, Donald Trump continued to push for action. He held press conferences addressing the need for police reform and condemning racial profiling. "What happened to Jacob Walker is not an isolated incident," he said during one televised speech. "It's part of a much larger problem, and we need to fix it. No one should be treated differently because of the color of their skin." The speech sparked another wave of discussions across the country. Talk shows and news programs debated the impact of Trump's words, with some praising his stance and others questioning his motivations. But regardless of the criticism, one thing was clear. Change was in motion. The officers involved in Jacob's stop, Grant and Daniels, were placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation. Public pressure mounted for them to be held accountable, and many people called for their dismissal and prosecution. The police department released a carefully worded statement, expressing regret if any actions were perceived as inappropriate. But for many, including Jacob, that wasn't enough. A few days later, Jacob received another call. This time it was from a representative at a national news network. They wanted him to appear on a live interview to share his story. Jacob hesitated, unsure if he was ready for that kind of spotlight. "Do it," his mother urged. "Your voice matters." So Jacob agreed. When the day of the interview arrived, he sat nervously in front of the camera, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. The interviewer leaned forward, her expression sympathetic but professional. "Jacob, thank you for being here. Can you tell us, in your own words, what happened that day?" Jacob took a deep breath, steadying himself. "I was just driving home. I wasn't speeding. I wasn't doing anything wrong. But they pulled me over anyway. And from the moment they walked up to my car, I could tell they thought I didn't belong." The interviewer nodded, her eyes filled with understanding. And then Donald Trump intervened. Jacob smiled faintly. "Yeah, I didn't expect that, but he showed up and he stood up for me when no one else would have." What would you say to those who believe this was a one-time incident, or that it's being blown out of proportion? Jacob's expression hardened slightly. "I'd say they're wrong. This isn't just about me. It's about every black person who's been stopped, questioned, or treated like a criminal for no reason. It's about a system that allows that to happen, and it has to change." The interview aired that night, sparking another wave of reactions. People across the country shared their own stories of racial profiling, adding their voices to the growing call for reform. The conversation was no longer just about Jacob. It was about a movement for justice and equality. As Jacob sat in his living room that night, watching the interview with his mother, he felt a sense of hope he hadn't felt in a long time. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but for the first time he believed that real change was possible. "This isn't over," his mother said softly, echoing his earlier thoughts. Jacob nodded. "No, it's not, but we're just getting started." The courtroom was packed. People filled every available seat, and a crowd gathered outside the courthouse, holding signs demanding justice. News crews had stationed themselves along the sidewalks, their cameras pointed toward the grand entrance, capturing every moment of the unfolding drama. The case of Officers Grant and Daniels had quickly become a national spectacle, and all eyes were now on this small courthouse in Virginia. Inside, Jacob sat quietly next to his mother, both of them dressed in formal attire. He fidgeted with his hands, his palms slightly sweaty. His heart was pounding, but he kept his gaze steady, refusing to let the nervous energy overtake him. His mother placed a reassuring hand on his arm, giving him a small nod of encouragement. Donald Trump entered the courtroom moments later, flanked by his security detail. The entire room seemed to shift as he walked in, his presence commanding attention. He acknowledged Jacob with a brief nod before taking his seat on the other side of the room. The sight of Trump in the courtroom only heightened the tension. It was rare for a former president to personally attend a trial like this, but Trump had made it clear from the start that he wasn't going to let this case be swept under the rug. The judge entered, and the courtroom rose to its feet. Once everyone was seated again, the proceedings began. The charges against Officers Grant and Daniels were read aloud: excessive use of force, racial profiling, and misconduct. Both officers sat stiffly at the defense table, their expressions unreadable. Jacob couldn't help but notice how different they looked now compared to that day on the highway. The smugness and arrogance were gone, replaced by tension and fear. The prosecution began with opening statements, laying out the events of that day in meticulous detail. They described how Jacob had been pulled over without cause, how he had been treated like a criminal despite doing nothing wrong, and how the officers had escalated the situation unnecessarily. They painted a clear picture of racial profiling, highlighting the systemic issues within law enforcement that allowed such behavior to persist. When it was time for Jacob to take the stand, he felt a wave of anxiety wash over him. He took a deep breath and stood, walking slowly to the witness box. As he sat down, he glanced at the crowd and saw familiar faces: his mother, Donald Trump, and even some of the protesters who had shown up to support him. Their presence gave him strength. The prosecutor approached him with a kind expression. "Jacob, can you tell the court what happened to you on the day you were pulled over?" Jacob nodded, his voice steady but firm. "I was driving home. I wasn't speeding or breaking any laws. I saw the police lights behind me, so I pulled over. I thought it was just a routine stop." "And what happened after you pulled over?" Jacob's hands tightened around the edges of the witness box. "The officer asked for my license and registration. I gave it to him, and he started asking me questions, like whether I owned the car, where I was going. Then he told me to step out of the car." "Did you feel that was necessary?" Jacob shook his head. "No, I wasn't doing anything wrong, but I complied because I was scared." The prosecutor nodded. "What happened next?" "They put me in handcuffs," Jacob said, his voice growing quieter. "They pushed me to the ground. One of them was pressing my face into the gravel. I remember thinking, this is it. They're not going to let me go." The courtroom was silent, hanging on Jacob's every word. And then Jacob glanced briefly at Trump before continuing. That's when Donald Trump showed up. He stopped his car, got out, and told the officers to take off the handcuffs. The prosecutor allowed a moment of silence before asking, "How did you feel when Mr. Trump arrived?" Jacob exhaled shakily. "Relieved, like someone finally saw me, like I wasn't alone." The defense attorney stood next, clearly eager to challenge Jacob's account. He approached the witness box with a smug expression that Jacob recognized all too well. "Jacob, you said you were scared. But isn't it true that you were acting defensively toward the officers?" Jacob frowned. "No, I did everything they asked. I didn't resist." The attorney raised an eyebrow. "Are you sure? They claim you were agitated and confrontational." "I was scared," Jacob said firmly, "not confrontational. I kept my hands visible the entire time, just like my mom taught me. I was respectful. They were the ones who escalated things." The defense attorney tried a few more questions, but Jacob remained calm and composed, refusing to let the man rattle him. When his testimony ended, he returned to his seat, his mother giving his hand a gentle squeeze. Next, it was Donald Trump's turn to take the stand. The courtroom buzzed with whispers as he walked confidently to the witness box. Once sworn in, the prosecutor began. "Mr. Trump, you are an eyewitness to the events in question. Can you describe what you saw?" Trump's voice was steady and authoritative. "I saw a young man being treated unfairly. He was lying on the ground in handcuffs. The officers were rummaging through his belongings without cause. It was clear to me that he was being profiled." The prosecutor nodded. "What made you stop your motorcade that day?" Trump leaned forward slightly. "Because it was the right thing to do. I saw an injustice happening, and I wasn't going to drive by and ignore it. Too many people have done that for too long." "And what do you believe should happen to the officers involved?" "They should be held accountable," Trump said firmly. "Actions have consequences. If we want to fix the problems in our justice system, we need to start by making sure officers like them are removed from their positions. Racism has no place in law enforcement." When the defense attorney stood to cross-examine Trump, there was a noticeable shift in the room. The attorney's confidence seemed to falter slightly under Trump's steady gaze. "Mr. Trump," the attorney began cautiously, "you've been accused by some of using this incident for political gain. How do you respond to that?" Trump didn't flinch. "This isn't about politics, it's about doing what's right. And if people want to criticize me for standing up against injustice, they can. I'll still do it." The attorney pressed on. "But surely you understand that your presence has influenced public opinion." Trump nodded. "Of course. That's the point. People need to see that someone is willing to stand up and say, 'Enough is enough.'" The defense attorney quickly ended his questioning, clearly realizing he wasn't going to win this argument. As the trial continued, more evidence was presented. Body cam footage from the officers showed clear signs of misconduct. Audio recordings captured their dismissive comments and harsh treatment of Jacob. The evidence was damning, leaving little room for doubt about their guilt. When the time came for closing arguments, the prosecutor stood before the jury. "This case isn't just about Jacob Walker. It's about every person who has ever been profiled, humiliated, or mistreated because of the color of their skin. Today, you have a chance to send a message that this behavior will no longer be tolerated." The defense's closing argument was weak in comparison, relying heavily on technicalities and attempts to downplay the officer's actions. But it was clear to everyone in the room that the jury had already made up their minds. After several hours of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict: guilty on all counts. A wave of relief washed over Jacob as the verdict was read aloud. His mother hugged him tightly, tears streaming down her face. The courtroom erupted in applause, though the judge quickly called for order. Outside, the crowd cheered as news of the verdict spread. Protesters held signs high, chanting for justice and equality. Reporters swarmed the courthouse steps, eager to capture reactions. Jacob stood quietly with his mother, watching the scene unfold. Trump approached him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You did good, kid," Trump said. "This is just the beginning." Jacob nodded, his voice steady. Thank you." As they stood together on the courthouse steps, cameras flashed, capturing the moment. A symbol of justice served and a reminder that change was possible. For the first time in a long time, Jacob felt hope. The days following the trial were a whirlwind for Jacob. News of the officer's guilty verdict spread across every major media outlet, and the public reaction was overwhelmingly supportive. People from all walks of life shared the story on social media, calling it a turning point in the fight against racial profiling. Jacob's name became synonymous with resilience and justice, but despite the sudden fame, he tried to keep his life as normal as possible. He wasn't interested in being a celebrity. All he wanted was to live in a world where people like him weren't seen as threats for simply existing. Sitting in his living room, Jacob scrolled through his phone, reading countless messages from strangers thanking him for his bravery. Many of them shared their own stories of being mistreated by police, stories that echoed his own experience. One message stood out to him. It was from a young girl named Maya, who wrote, "Because of you, I finally reported what happened to me. I was too scared before, but seeing you stand up gave me the courage. Thank you." Jacob felt a lump in his throat as he read her words. He forwarded the message to his mom, typing a short note. "This is why it matters." His mother walked into the room, carrying 2 mugs of tea. She set one down in front of him and took a seat on the couch. "You okay, baby?" Jacob nodded, though his mind was still processing everything that had happened. "Yeah, it's just a lot." "I know." She gave him a reassuring smile. "You've been through more than anyone should ever have to, but you handled it with grace. I'm proud of you." Jacob took a sip of his tea, the warmth helping to calm his nerves. "I just keep thinking about how many people don't get this kind of outcome. How many people don't have someone like Trump to step in and help." His mother reached over and placed a hand on his knee. "That's why you need to keep using your voice. People are listening now. You can make a difference." Before Jacob could respond, there was a knock at the door. His mother stood and walked over to answer it. When she opened the door, Jacob was surprised to see Donald Trump standing there, flanked by 2 of his security agents. "Mr. Trump," his mother said, her eyes wide with surprise. "Please, come in." Trump stepped inside, offering a polite nod. "Thank you, ma'am." Jacob stood, feeling both nervous and grateful. "Mr. Trump, I didn't expect to see you." Trump gave him a small smile. "I wanted to check in on you. I know things have been chaotic, and I figured it'd be better to talk face to face than over the phone." Jacob nodded, gesturing toward the couch. "Please, have a seat." They all sat down, and for a moment there was a comfortable silence. Trump glanced around the modest living room, his expression thoughtful. "You've handled yourself well, Jacob," Trump finally said. "Not everyone would have the strength to go through what you did and come out on the other side stronger." Jacob shrugged. "I didn't feel strong at the time. I was scared." "That's what makes it impressive," Trump said. "You were scared, but you didn't let it stop you. That's real courage." Jacob glanced at his mother, who was smiling proudly. "Thank you, sir. I appreciate everything you did for me." Trump waved a hand dismissively. "I just did what anyone should do. The real question is, what's next for you?" Jacob frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" "I mean, you've got a platform now. People are paying attention to you. You can use that to push for change. There are still too many people out there who don't get the justice they deserve. You can be a voice for them." Jacob considered Trump's words carefully. He had never thought of himself as an activist or a leader, but the idea of helping others appealed to him. I guess I never really thought about it like that." Trump leaned forward, his expression serious. "Think about it. Your story is powerful, Jacob. Use it." They continued talking for a while, discussing ways Jacob could get involved in advocacy work. Trump shared stories of other people he had helped throughout his career and emphasized the importance of fighting for those who couldn't fight for themselves. As the conversation wound down, Trump stood to leave. He shook Jacob's hand firmly. "Stay in touch. And if you ever need anything, you know how to reach me." Jacob nodded. "Thank you, sir. I will." After Trump left, Jacob sat back down on the couch, his mind racing with possibilities. His mother sat beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You're going to do great things, Jacob. I can feel it." The next few weeks were a blur of meetings and interviews. Jacob spoke at community events, shared his story with students, and even testified before a congressional committee on police reform. His words carried weight, and people listened. He received countless messages from people who had experienced similar injustices, thanking him for speaking out and giving them hope. One evening, Jacob stood on a stage at a national conference on social justice. The room was packed with activists, policymakers, and community leaders. As he approached the podium, he took a deep breath, steadying his nerves. "My name is Jacob Walker," he began, his voice clear and steady. "And a few months ago, I was pulled over by the police for no reason other than the fact that I didn't look like someone who should be driving a nice car. They treated me like a criminal before I had the chance to prove I wasn't. That's the reality for too many people in this country, but it doesn't have to be." The room was silent as Jacob shared his story, describing the fear, the humiliation, and the relief he felt when Trump arrived to help him. He spoke about the importance of accountability, the need for police reform, and the power of standing up for what's right. "This isn't just about me," Jacob continued. "It's about everyone who's ever been profiled, mistreated, or made to feel like they don't belong. It's about creating a system where everyone is treated with respect and dignity, regardless of the color of their skin." When he finished, the audience erupted in applause. Jacob stepped back from the podium, feeling a surge of pride and determination. He had found his voice, and he wasn't going to stop using it. After the conference, Jacob received a text from Trump. "Proud of you, kid. Keep going." Jacob smiled as he read the message. He knew there was still a long road ahead, but he felt ready to face it. He was no longer the scared teenager lying on the side of the road, wondering if he'd make it home. He was stronger now. He was a fighter. As he walked out of the conference hall, the evening air felt cool and refreshing. The city lights twinkled in the distance, and for the first time in a long time, Jacob felt hopeful. He knew that change wouldn't happen overnight, but he also knew that every step he took brought him closer to a better future. With his mother by his side, Jacob walked toward the waiting car. As they drove home, he gazed out the window, watching the world go by. The road ahead was long, but it was filled with possibility. "We're just getting started," Jacob said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. His mother smiled. "Yes, we are. Thank you for watching." What do you think about Donald Trump stepping in to defend Jacob Walker? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. We read every single one. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories that reveal the truth and fight for justice. Your support really helps us make a difference. See you in the next video.